And you're listening to Good Morning Scotland with Gary and Laura. The time now, 24 minutes to 7. And Scotland's population is predicted to start falling by the end of this decade. The forecast from the National Records of Scotland suggests it'll peak just shy of 5.5 million and then fall back. So what impact will a shrinking population have on the economy, and what can be done to mitigate that? Well, let's talk to the director of the Fraser of Allander Institute, Professor Mairi Spowage, and Professor Rebecca Kay, chair of the Scottish Government's Independent Expert Advisory Group on Population and Migration, and also a senior researcher at the think tank Migration Policy Scotland. Good morning to both of you. And Mairi, first and foremost, what changes when a population shrinks?
Well, it's really important to look at the factors that are driving the fall in the population. And it is a combination of factors where we're having fewer children. So there's less children entering the population. And we're also seeing people generally over the last 50 years live longer, although some of those gains have started to stall a little bit in recent years. So these are both contributing to the fact our population is aging and will start to decline as essentially the natural change, so births minus death, starts to outweigh the positive contribution that we see from migration. It is important as well to emphasise that these are projections of past trends continuing. So they are just projections. There are things that potentially, in terms of policy, that could be done to try and deal with some of these issues.
Well, Rebecca, let's talk about immigration. To what extent can increasing immigration help?
Well, I think increasing immigration can make a difference, and what we've seen in population trends over the last 20 years in Scotland is the impact of free movement, bringing a lot of people from the European Union to Scotland and making a big difference to our population growth. I think migration going forward is unlikely to continue to have that kind of influence at a nationwide level because of the change in migration rules. But if we stop thinking in terms of replacement numbers, migration can still have a role to play in strategic mitigation of population decline.
In what way? So because I imagine you're meaning that Brexit, so there's far fewer people from Europe moving here, but presumably there'll be people moving from other countries. But also then, do people move within the UK?
Yes, absolutely. So we don't know exactly yet the impact of Brexit on migration. The data isn't accurate enough. But at a UK level, migration is still quite high, net migration. It doesn't look like the numbers of people coming has fallen especially. But what has definitely changed is the profile of people who are coming. So there is a significant fall in the people coming from the EU, and many more people are coming from places like India, Nigeria and Pakistan. This makes a big difference to Scotland because EU migrants made up a much bigger proportion of Scotland's migrant communities than it does south of the border. And Scotland also doesn't have the kind of diversity within the population that means that migrant networks would bring people from those countries to think necessarily about Scotland. That said, we know from EU migration that people can move within the country. We know that there are routes and migrants who are thinking about coming to Scotland. And strategic mitigation means thinking not about Scotland as a whole, but looking in a bit more detail at the picture of what's happening to the population in Scotland.
About where they're choosing to live.
Well, where they're choosing to live, but also where the real pressure points are around this process of population decline and population ageing. So if you look at the NRS report, there are maps in there that show very clearly that the picture is quite different across different parts of Scotland. The population isn't falling everywhere. On the East Coast and in the large cities, the population is actually growing. And if we go down to a more nuanced local level, even somewhere like Orkney, there's a big difference between Stornoway and the Outer Isles. So strategic mitigation means attracting people to those parts of Scotland where they can really make a difference. For example, in keeping services open, both as workers and as users, shifting the demographic balance. International migrants tend to be working age.
So I'm just going to say Stornoway's not in Orkney, by the way, just because everybody listening there will be really annoyed. It's in the Western Isles. It's early in the morning. I know that, it was a slip of the tongue. Mairi, I suppose all of this is fine, but if our population is ageing and the people who are coming here perhaps are more expensive to look after in the terms that we need to improve our language skills, etc., if they're coming from different areas? What difference will that make to the economy?
Yeah, overall, because our population is ageing, and we're having there's fewer births than other parts of the UK. People tend to cost more to look after as they get older. They tend to draw more on health and social care services. So it does suggest that the balance of what we spend on health and social care will have to increase, which we have seen in recent years. But that's likely to going to have to continue. And the Scottish Fiscal Commission also produced a report this week looking at the impacts that these demographic changes could have on our economic growth. And they're sort of forecasting that would mean that the growth of our economy is significantly less than the UK as a whole over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Because of these demographic changes.
Can I ask about that, Mairi? Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. But you're sort of looking at going, we're hearing that the population is going to decrease, but it's going to fall by 1.8%. It's a little over 100,000 people. It's only going to fall, it's not falling massively.
It's not falling massively, but it is ageing considerably. So, the proportion of people who are over 65 is going to increase hugely. So we're seeing that ageing shift as well. And people aged over 65 are much less likely to be working and therefore contributing to tax receipts. And there's likely to have to be more spent on health and social care services. So, it's not just that the population is projected to start to fall, but it's also that it's going to be ageing hugely as well, which does have implications for service delivery.
And Rebecca, just finally, lots of the levers on migration are held at Westminster, but are there solutions that the Scottish Government can look to, or can they work together on this?
Yeah, I think there are, and I think it's about having a wider and more sophisticated debate about what Scotland can do with existing powers to attract migrants who are still coming to the UK, as well as discussing with the UK Parliament or government what different kinds of migration systems might be needed. So we need to think about things like housing, transport, connectivity. What would bring people to those parts of Scotland that really need them, and what sorts of skills and profiles of migrants are needed in those areas. So you can think, for example, of the impact that a doctor and her family might have in a small rural community struggling to keep its health service and its school afloat.
Interesting times ahead. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Professor Rebecca Kay there, head chair of the Scottish Government's Independent Expert Advisory Group on Population Migration. And before that, we heard from Professor Mairi Spowage, who's director of the Fraser of Allander Institute.